Every 20th century housing disaster begins the same way, with a beautiful drawing, a clean white model on an architect's desk, promising some vision of utopia for the masses. Despite designers' best efforts to help people, they ended up creating some of the worst housing disasters in history. Hi everyone, Ken here. Hit that subscribe button, and let's dive into a special episode of This House. We'll begin with Pruitt-Igoe, because nothing else on this list comes close to its symbolic weight. Pruitt-Igoe was designed by Minoru Yamasaki, designer of the original World Trade Center towers, for the DeSoto Car neighborhood of North St. Louis, a section of the city that had been condemned in the late 1940s as a slum and subsequently bulldozed. The new development was named for two men, Wendell O. Pruitt, a Tuskegee airman from St. Louis who had died young in a training accident, and William L. Igoe, a former Missouri congressman. The hyphenation was no accident. The project was originally to be racially segregated, with the Pruitt Towers designed for black residents and the Igoe Towers for white. By the time it opened in 1954, the U.S. Supreme Court had struck down such arrangements, and the racial segregation was officially abandoned. But the white tenants, by and large, simply never moved in. Architectural Forum magazine had declared the design the best high apartment of the year in 1951, 2 full years before the buildings even existed, and visitors marveled at Yamasaki's clever skip-stop elevators, which only stopped on every third floor, forcing residents onto wide gallery walkways that were supposed to function as airborne community streets where children would play and neighbors would hang out. 33 identical 11-story slabs containing nearly 3,000 apartments rose in the Missouri sky. The new residents were almost entirely poor and almost entirely black, working families and single mothers being relocated from the very slums the towers had replaced. By the early 1960s, those airborne streets had become exactly the opposite of what Yamasaki had imagined. The elevators were broken so often that elderly residents simply stopped leaving their apartments. The gallery walkways had become a venue for muggings. The corridors smelled of human waste because the toilets in the common spaces had been removed to save money. And tenants were fleeing in such numbers that entire buildings sat empty. In 1969, the residents went on a 9-month rent strike. In 1972, with vacancy rates above 60% and federal inspectors describing conditions as unfit for human habitation, the city of St. Louis began dynamiting the buildings one by one. Footage of the first tower coming down was broadcast on evening news, and the architectural critic Charles Jenks later declared that exact moment to be the official death of modern architecture itself. It was, depending on who you ask, either a wild exaggeration or a wishful obituary. Our next failure takes us a mile and a half from Chicago's Gold Coast, on land that had once been a Sicilian slum nicknamed Little Hell. The Francis Cabrini row houses, completed in 1942 and named for the recently canonized patron saint of immigrants, were low-rise red brick 2-story homes laid out around courtyards, racially integrated almost from the start, and widely considered a genuine success. The trouble began with the additions. The Cabrini extension in 1958, known thereafter as the Reds for the red brick, packed thousands of additional families into 15-story towers. And the William Green homes in 1962, known as the Whites for their pale concrete, pushed the towers up to 19 stories. By the time it was all finished, the complex housed roughly 15,000 people in the shadow of one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in the country. The original tenants had been a deliberate mix of working-class Italians, African Americans, and Puerto Rican families, finding their footing in the city. Within 20 years, restrictive income caps pushed out the families on the way up, and a steady annual cut to maintenance budgets had transformed the development into a near entirely black community, deeply impoverished and almost entirely abandoned by the city that had built it. By the 1970s, the towers had become a vertical battlefield for the warring gangster disciples and vice lords, and the elevated outdoor walkways that had once been hailed as innovative had to be caged in chain-link fencing to stop residents from being thrown off of them. Elevators broke and stayed broken for weeks. Garbage chutes overflowed onto the floors below. In October of 1992, a 7-year-old boy named Duntrell Davis was walking the 70 yards from his front door to his school, holding his mother's hand when a sniper shot him from the 10th floor of a nearby tower. This event galvanized a demolition campaign that would take nearly 2 decades to complete. The final high-rise came down in 2011, and the land it once stood on, that mile-and-a-half stretch between the Loop and the Gold Coast, is now home to some of the most expensive real estate in the nation. If Cabrini-Green was the most famous Chicago housing failure, Robert Taylor Homes was simply the largest, stretching for 2 solid miles along the eastern edge of the Dan Ryan Expressway, which had itself been built in part to function as a racial barrier between the South Side and the white neighborhoods to the east. The development consisted of 28 identical 16-story buildings arranged in U-shaped clusters, holding roughly 4,400 apartments. At its peak in the 1970s, the project officially housed 27,000 people, 95% of them African American, virtually all of them poor. Life inside Robert Taylor in its worst years was meticulously documented by the sociologist Sudhir Venkatesh in Gang Leader for a Day, which described a place where the elevators ran on the gang's schedule rather than the buildings, where mothers gave their children specific instructions about which stairwells were safe at which times of day, and where a power outage could last for weeks because Chicago's housing authority repair crews simply would not enter the building without a police escort. Demolition began in 1998 and finished in 2007. Today the land remains largely vacant, a 4-mile strip of Chicago that the city seems unable to figure out what to do with. But not all of this happened in America, and not every problem was a social one. Let's go over to London's Ronan Point. On the morning of May 16, 1968, a 56-year-old cake decorator named Ivy Hodge struck a match to light her stove in flat 90 of Ronan Point, a 22-story apartment tower. What Ivy did not know was that the gas connection behind her cooker had a leak. The resulting explosion was pretty modest, but the problem was the building. Ronan Point had been constructed in roughly 18 months using a Danish prefabricated panel system called Larsen Nielsen, in which the walls of each flat had been cast in a factory and slotted together on site, with each wall helping to hold up the flats above it. The connections between the panels were essentially just bolts and friction. When Ivy's kitchen wall blew outward, the corner of the tower above it had nothing to rest on, and so it fell. The corner below then had a tower's worth of concrete dropped onto it, and so it fell too. The entire southeast corner of the building progressively fell like dominoes, floor by floor, all the way to the ground. The tower had been occupied for less than 2 months. It was demolished piece by piece so engineers could study exactly what happened. On the northern edge of Naples, Italy in the early 1960s, the architect Franz di Salvo set out to build something genuinely visionary. Inspired by the megastructures of Le Corbusier and the older Italian rationalist, he designed a working-class neighborhood of 7 enormous apartment blocks linked by internal walkways wide enough that residents could meet, mingle, and recreate the social life of a traditional Italian street, only stacked vertically into the sky. He called them Le Vele, or in English, the sails, because of their distinctive triangular profile, which narrowed as they rose. The 7 blocks were color-coded, and the intended residents were the working families of Naples, dock workers, shop assistants, the chronically underemployed of one of the poorest large cities in Europe, being moved out of the city's notoriously overcrowded historic center into something the post-war Italian government promised would be modern, dignified, and humane. By the time the project was nearing completion in the mid-1970s, the funding for landscaping services and basic maintenance had been largely evaporated. Then, in November of 1980, an earthquake struck Campania, leaving hundreds of thousands homeless across the region. The unfinished and partially occupied villas suddenly absorbed thousands of additional displaced families, many of them taking over apartments that had no doors, no working plumbing, and no functioning electrical service. Within a few years, the Camorra had moved in to fill the vacuum the state had left, and the internal walkways that Di Salvo had imagined as social streets had become the controlled corridors of one of the largest open-air markets for illicit substances in Europe. Demolition began in 1997 and continued one sale at a time. One has been preserved as a kind of memorial to what was a failed vision of a utopia. Across the Thames from central London, the Aylesbury Estate was once the largest housing project in Europe. Roughly 2,700 homes were spread across vast brutalist slabs, connected by a continuous network of elevated walkways nearly a mile long, the so-called streets in the sky that modernists kept insisting were the future of working-class life. The walkways were broad enough to drive a small delivery van down, and they linked one block to the next without ever descending to ground level. The intended residents were the working families of inner South London, many of them being rehoused from the wartime-damaged Victorian terraces that had previously stood on the site, with a deliberate policy of moving entire neighborhoods together in the hope of preserving their social networks. Construction was finally completed in 1977, by which point the optimism that had launched the project a decade earlier was already curdling. By the 1990s, the estate had become the national shorthand for British urban decay. Demolition has been underway in slow motion since 2010 and is still not finished. Staying in the UK, in Manchester, the planners of the early 1970s decided that the way to honor Britain's architectural heritage was to name 4 enormous concrete megastructures after 4 of the country's greatest Georgian architects: Robert Adam, John Nash, Charles Barry, and William Kent. The Hulme Crescents, completed in 1972, were made of cheap, system-built concrete panels, stood as much as 8 stories high, and were assembled in roughly 18 months. The intended residents were the working families of Hulme, a dense Victorian inner-city neighborhood whose terrace streets have been bulldozed in one of the largest slum clearance programs Britain had ever attempted. Roughly 5,000 families were rehoused into the new estate. Within just a few years, the buildings had developed catastrophic problems. The concrete panels had been sealed with materials that failed almost immediately, allowing damp to seep into every flat and breed infestations so severe that cockroaches were said to rain from the ceilings. By the late 1970s, the Crescents were almost entirely abandoned by the families they had been built for, and were colonized through the 1980s by squatters, art students, anarchist collectives, factory record musicians, and the early Manchester acid house scene, which gave the dying building a brief and chaotic second life as one of the most creatively fertile slums in post-war Europe. Demolition began in 1991. From construction to destruction, the 4 Crescents had lasted less than a quarter of a century. Over in Ireland, in June of 1963, 2 Victorian tenement houses in central Dublin collapsed within a single week, with fatalities. The shock galvanized the Irish government into doing something dramatic. What it decided to do was build on a patch of farmland 4 miles north of the city center, 7 enormous tower blocks of 15 stories each, the tallest residential buildings ever constructed in Ireland. Roughly 30,000 people moved into the Ballymun Flats between 1966 and 1969. From the very beginning, however, the basic services that had been promised never materialized. The shopping center arrived years later. The community center was never built at all. The single bus route that connected Ballymun to the rest of Dublin ran infrequently and stopped early in the evening, leaving thousands of residents stranded miles from the city they had been told they were still a part of. By the 1980s, the towers had become notorious. Crime, broken elevators, and illicit substance markets. The last of the towers came down in 2015. And with that, I'll turn it over to you. Did anything stick out to you about these failed housing disasters? Let me know down below in the comments section, and while you're there, make sure you're subscribed so you never miss an interesting episode of This House.